Coming up on Dr. Kiki Science Hour, we're talking about Science Commons with John Wilbanks from the Science Commons. That's up next on Dr. Kiki Science Hour.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit. Bandwidth for Dr. Kiki's Science Hour is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Dr. Kiki's Science Hour with Dr. Kiki Sanford, episode 59, recorded on August 12th, 2010. What's so common about science? Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Dr. Kiki Science Hour. I am Dr. Kiki, and this is the hour that we get to discuss science, the lovely world around us, and how to investigate it, how to explore it. And today, it's time to get down and dirty in the world of open data and open science and answer the question of, can science really have a science commons? Is it possible to create an entirely open scientific endeavor globally? Is that possible? So we're going to get into that a bit today. Find out maybe what the fuss is. There seems to be quite a hubbub around the idea of open science these days. We'll dig into it with our guest today. Joining us is John Wilbanks. He is the Vice President of Science at the Creative Commons Science Commons. John has a very interesting biography. I found it on the Science Commons website and also grabbed some things from Wikipedia. You cannot get away from the world in Wikipedia, that open place. Anyway, John came to Creative Commons from a fellowship at the World Wide Web Consortium in Semantic Web for Life Sciences. Before that, he founded and led to acquisition in Celico, a bioinformatics company that built semantic graph networks for use in pharmaceutical research and development. Even before that, John was the first assistant director at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard Law School. He is a research affiliate at the MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory in the Project on Mathematics and Computation, and he serves on all sorts of advisory boards for open science and open data and communications. In Wikipedia, it says he's been called a game changer by Seed Magazine and one of the top 50 visionaries who are changing your world by the Utne Reader. So without further ado, I'd love to find out, John, how it feels to be a game changer and a top visionary changing the world. Do you feel that way on a daily basis?
Not really, no. We spend most of our time doing email.
Okay, answer that email. There we go.
I think most of these lists come from people who do lots of speaking, and so a lot of it comes from being out and giving a lot of speeches. And once you learn how to do slides well, it's incredible. People will assign you the visionary title pretty quickly.
Oh my gosh, he knows how to make a presentation that's not completely boring.
I'm telling you, it's a big part of it. It's a big part of it.
All right, I'm going to work on it. The PowerPoint presentations that are engaging, I will be a game changer.
That's the first step.
All right, first step, you heard it here, folks. But let's dig into the reason why people are calling you such names. The idea that science can be open. Can you explain just the basics of what the Science Commons is?
Sure. So the best way to start is that there's a long tradition of the idea of common spaces in culture, and that is culture in the artistic sense, in the scientific sense, in the educational sense, which is that there's value to shared spaces where you don't have to ask permission to do everything. And so the word of the commons, the whole concept of the commons, comes to us from the idea of the commons in England, when the common land was land that anyone could use. And so it's where the word commoner comes from. And so there was a great enclosure movement where fences went up on public lands, and property rights began to be enforced. That led to the first partitioning of the commons. And so Science Commons, Creative Commons, and many of the other commons-based organizations come from the realization that on the internet, on the web, that what we have here is actually a common space. It's a space that anyone can connect to. You don't have to ask permission to connect to the internet. You don't have to ask permission to put up a web page. But the potential of that technology really is at odds with the way that our laws work around copying things and using things. That's because those laws were created in a world where the internet really wasn't a reality yet. So what we try to do is to bring some balance between the potential of the technology and the reality of the legal system, so that the sorts of potential that the internet brings for shared creation, for widespread distribution of knowledge, so that that potential can be realized in a way that is legal and in a way that is coherent with both businesses and educational systems, in a way that is really capable of growth.
Right. How did it come out? I mean, the Creative Commons, I saw the growth of the Creative Commons as people were starting to figure out, with the internet, how do we let people use works of art, the creative things? And then the Science Commons has kind of sprouted out of that. Did the Science Commons start on its own and then partner with Creative Commons, or is it actually a child sprouting from the Creative Commons?
We are sort of like a wholly owned subsidiary of Creative Commons. So I'm sitting here in the Creative Commons offices in San Francisco. This is where you can email me, is at creativecommons.org. And where Science Commons came from was from the observation that the Public Library of Science and Biomed Central and many of the journals that were trying to take advantage of the internet to facilitate more distribution of journal articles were beginning to use the Creative Commons copyright licenses to manage the copyrights around the journal articles. So that was really where we got our start. And the idea was we were seeing these uses of the Creative Commons copyright licenses, which make it easy to grant to the world the right to copy and distribute a creative work in the scientific journal and scientific communication space. And then our charge was to see where else standardized legal tools that facilitated sharing might be of use. And so we've spent the last 5 years looking at things like how can we make data more accessible legally and technically? How can we begin to free up some of the materials that are inside the laboratory, which are an essential part of the research process but aren't digital? How can we make those more available using network technologies? And then most recently, we've actually begun to get involved in creating standardized tools and systems for patent licensing. Because if you make the research cycle more efficient, you create not only more papers, but more inventions. And the way that those get licensed is actually a pretty essential part, not just of the science being out there, but of the ability to turn that science into a technology that can actually help people in the real world.
Is this becoming more and more of a concern as people, as people look at the internet and really start seeing more of its potential? I'm just curious. I mean, there are a lot of people who look at the internet as this, it's we want to control it and pay for access and make sure that it's just one big commercial money making scheme. How do you manage that and try and maintain the keeping it open?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
The internet at its core is really just a set of shared values. And those values are values like interoperability and standardization. So even though the fibers across which most of the network traffic pass are private, the public standards and the technical standards guarantee that the information makes it across. So the folks who invented Skype, which is how you and I are having this conversation, didn't have to call the founders of the internet to get permission, because the system was designed to allow for unanticipated use. And the science has sort of always been the same way. Science has always been designed for unanticipated discoveries.
Right.
And although we have all sorts of systems to review and validate and check new claims in science, and those serve to keep out bunk claims of cold fusion or to unmask acts of scientific fraud, the system is designed for revolution in science. It always has been. And so I think it shares that fundamental character with the internet. The difficulty in maintaining open systems is that when you create enough value, there's always going to be an incentive for businesses to try to capture some of that value. And that's what you're seeing in the net neutrality debates in the Google Verizon statement that came out this week. Is there are some companies that have a privileged position on the network that would like to use that to monetize it. But the openness of the system itself is sort of an immune system. And it's the same immune system that happens in science. You know, when the systems don't work anymore, there's a route you can take to get around it. And that's how you get, in science, plate tectonics, you know, changing earth sciences despite 70 years of people making fun of it.
Right.
And that's how you get, you know, what Kuhn would call a paradigm shift. The network makes that possible, and sort of the very fabric of science makes that possible. And one of the benefits of the commons or of open science is that it increases the rate at which those sorts of breakthroughs can happen, because you're not putting all this friction into the system where everyone is always asking, you know, permission to buy one article for $30 before they can take the knowledge in that article and run another experiment. They can relatively rapidly search for things. Entrepreneurs can start companies and start, you know, text mining all those articles together. And you just sort of decrease the overall activation potential required for new scientific knowledge to get created.
Right. You mentioned, you know, it's kind of like the immune system, and I think that's a really interesting point to make. I was thinking today about how science tends to learn a lot from studying things that are wrong in systems. So in terms of neuroscience, we learn a lot about how the brain works by studying disorders where the brain isn't working correctly. So we find out how particular areas of the brain work as a result of, you know, oh, this person has aphasia or whatever it happens to be. Can we actually apply that similar process to science itself in looking at how the science commons and open data can benefit the practice of science, the endeavor of science?
Well, I mean, that's certainly what I think, or I wouldn't do what I do. The thing about science is that the systems that protect science from junky hypotheses also protect science from systems that might actually benefit science.
Yeah.
And so there's this entire crust around it, the way that we fund science, the way that we train scientists, the way that we reward and give tenure to scientists. Reward's a very incremental approach to life, to smaller and smaller yes-no questions that can be bundled into an R01 grant and funded. And so you don't get rewarded for negative results, right? The very phrase negative results
Right.
is very revealing. And so I think that's part of what makes it hard to do this sort of transformative change, is that there's not a lot of immune system resistance to changing the way we deliver songs. So, you know, from when I was a kid going to, you know, I actually used to go to the record store. Right? That's a very anachronistic way of thinking. Because everything about the music consumption experience is different now.
Right.
But, you know, the experience of publishing in an academic journal has been streamlined by the internet, but it hasn't been, you know, fundamentally changed from a metaphor perspective. You still bundle up 3 years worth of research into an article and submit it somewhere. And if you think about the transformative change of the internet, you know, I graduated from college in '94. If I were a practicing PhD, maybe I get my PhD in '99, and then I do my postdoc, and I'm done maybe in '03, '04. And so I'm finishing my first RO1 right now if I was tremendously successful.
And an RO1 for people who might not know is a grant application so that you can actually get money from the government.
Right. Sorry about that. And so maybe I'm just finishing that first one up, and I'm trying to get an assistant professorship on a tenure track now. And so the entire internet transformation that has changed culture so dramatically has taken place right there in the span at the beginning of my career. And so my incentive to begin suddenly throwing everything open, publishing everything openly, when I've actually got a lab with 3 employees I've got to take care of and I've got to keep funded, there's not a lot of incentive for me to jump out and innovate or deviate from the norm.
Yeah.
Especially given that there's not a lot of money for those things. And that's the immune system to me. It's the inertia in the way that we train, reward, and fund your average scientist. And so the place where we've seen real change getting taken up in the life sciences in particular has come from non-traditional funders of science who are a little less patient with the bureaucracy and the infrastructure of the traditional system. They're much more willing to begin exercising the leverage that funders have to mandate that things be open. And then the government can sort of follow along as those private foundations and private funders lead the way in terms of policy on openness.
I'm interested also to talk about the idea of how it might influence the actual practice of science. You bring up, why is a young investigator going to be interested in doing something different, in opening up their data, in sharing with other people when that hasn't been the norm, when that hasn't been what people have been doing? How do you get them interested? How do you create a system where that works? And that's something that people want to do. But what about a system right now where the competition is so high and it's not just sharing, there are also incidences of data falsification and academic misconduct. So this week, I think it was Harvard University, Professor Mark Hauser, he's a cognitive scientist. He has done, and the ironic the part of this story is that he does studies on animal morality, trying to determine if animals have morality. And it turns out that he's falsified a whole bunch of data, and at least one paper has been retracted, if not more. Is opening up the system, opening up data, possibly going to lead to a system where there's less data falsification?
I certainly think so. There's a saying in the open source software community, which is that with many eyes, all of the flaws in software are easy to find. And I think you're going to see something like that in the academic fraud sense. It's much easier to cheat when no one's looking, right?
Right.
And if you open things up to the world, then you are it's not just that you're opening it up to the world like my mom and my dad. You're opening it up to all of the peers around the world, not just the peers who have the money to access the article that you wrote. And if you open up the data that are associated with those articles, then if I have made claims that are unsupported by my data, then I can be called to account for that by a researcher, not just a researcher at Harvard or at MIT, but a researcher who's coming in from Brazil or a researcher who's coming in from Vietnam, who would otherwise not have any traditional network by which to talk to me. And that's sort of one way I think you can deal with it. Another way is that the internet enables at its first pass a relatively cheap form of plagiarism. It's easy to Photoshop out the images from an article in English and publish it in another language, hoping that the editors will not have seen the original. But Google image search finds that and makes it really hard for me to get away with it. So I think that increasing the access to this information, it just makes it harder to hide behind a lack of information. And it makes it harder to get away with plagiarism. And those are things that are some of the beneficial aspects of technology, is that it's very hard to get away with unsupportable data on the internet by yelling, "Do you know who I am?" But in a traditional context, a powerful professor in a small field can really disproportionately influence simply by saying, "Do you know who I am?" And the internet makes that harder to do, and I think that's probably pretty frightening to those who are in power, and probably pretty exciting to those who aren't.
Right. There are a bunch of really interesting questions that are coming from the chat room as well during this conversation that we're having. Science Quiche, who I believe is Kishore Hari. Hello, Kishore. He asks if there's any kind of business models or ways to make this, to open it up and actually make it appealing in a money-making kind of way, as opposed to opening. This is just good for humanity, so it should be open. That's not going to work for everyone.
Right. Well, and so it's important to note that at the heart of the idea of the commons is the idea of balance between closed and open systems. It's sort of an estuary in many ways where private action is possible. It's not all sort of linking arms, singing Kumbaya, and giving it all away. So I think that business models are going to be a key part of this. One of the rules that I tend to subscribe to it was from Clayton Christensen at Harvard Business School. He's famous for writing The Innovator's Dilemma. And one of his rules is called the law of, I believe it's called the law of attractive profits. And the idea is that when you make one layer of content or services into a commodity, either by having one company dominate it, by the creation of a standard, or through the creation of public goods, that you create value in the adjacent layers. And so when you think about data, let's go back to the example if I had a PhD.
Yeah.
I would have trained in the early to mid 90s in an era in which data was still pretty hard to come by. And now I would be entering my assistant professorship in an era where I'm constantly overwhelmed by data. And I've got a lab credit card that I use to buy reagents, and I use to buy computers. I think that service providers who can make it easy to annotate data so that it's useful to other people are going to be tremendously valuable businesses in the future. I think that someone is going to eventually come up with a web browser that's good for data instead of documents. And I think whoever does that's going to be filthy rich. Think about it. We've had 350 years culturally to get used to documents.
Right.
And so the jump from non-network documents to network documents was a jump inside documents. We've not mentally had the time to get ready to data, so we don't know to deal with data. We don't know how to visualize it. We don't know how to browse it. We don't know how to hyperlink it. And someone's going to crack that, and that's going to create an entire class of markets around curation, annotation, search, advertising, and all sorts of value-added services. And I think that's where the business models will be. They won't be new business models. They'll be old business models, but they'll be enabled on data by the creation of some technologies that we don't have yet.
That's always the case. It's the technology will be coming, so we need to be prescient and keep that in mind.
Yeah, I mean, the web browser was sort of a matter of time. There were like more than 50 hypertext systems kicking around by the late 80s when the web finally came into being. And part of that was that no one had gotten it quite right, and Tim Berners-Lee figured a bunch of things out that were non-obvious. Part of it is that Tim put it in the public domain so that everybody could build on it. And part of it is that it was time. There was a certain density of people with computers and maturity of the interconnection technologies. And so I think that there's a good chance that whatever the magic technology is, we've already got it or something close to it. We just don't have sufficient density of users and data to sort of get the critical mass where people start radically and rapidly improving those technologies. It's easier to try to go start the next Facebook.
Right. There was something that you would actually, just in terms of, I guess, educating people and getting people to think about how the technology is changing and curating the data and thinking in this sense of having too much data that you're having to deal with constantly. I was reading through your blog, and you made this statement that in one of your postings that you think that we need to mandate data literacy the way we mandate language literacy. Can you explain that a little?
Right. I mean, the best way, have you ever had a conversation about statistics with someone who didn't take statistics? It's, there's so much in our culture, especially as we become a data-rich culture, that really requires a basic knowledge about what data is and what it means. And again, we've had hundreds of years since Gutenberg to culturally assimilate documents, and now we're having to assimilate data at almost incomprehensible scales in like a 20, 30-year time frame. And so, we make kids take English. We make kids take foreign languages here in the United States. Every country has language requirements in their education program. And so I would like there to start to be a similar conversation about curricula around data. What's data? What does it mean? How does the way we analyze it bias the conclusions we can get out of it? In the life sciences or in climate sciences, you have enormous disagreements about what conclusions people should draw from data. And we're going to start making very big decisions based on that kind of data. We decide whether a drug should be legally marketed to people. We decide what our policies should be around carbon emissions. We decide what our policies should be around where our government investments and money goes. And we're doing all of that on the basis of data, but we're doing almost all of that on the recommendations of a very small elite of people who actually understand data.
Right.
And I think that's not inherently a good way to mitigate the risks we face as a society and as a culture across the world. I mean, we've got some really big decisions to make about where people should be living if the seas rise due to climate change. All of those questions are driven by data. And, I don't know enough about data to know whether or not the models are true or not. We tend to trust the people we agree with, and that's not scalable.
Right. I think it's just a really interesting perspective on it. It's an entirely new problem, an entirely new way of thinking about what we need to do moving forward, so that if we really are going to have open science and we really are going to have open access and have even understanding, analysis, decision making based on data, people need to know how to look at it. It's really important. Yeah. There was another question based on the grant applications, and the Dr. Mom in the chat room made the observation that the NIH actually has a lot of stipulations and holdings on data and on the research that researchers are doing, and don't they usually get some first look at stuff before data is opened up? And I guess a second part to that as well, another person had asked about how all this ties into national security concerns and research that people are doing that might be in the instance of national security.
Those are both good questions. I will try to unpack them. So the NIH has a requirement that says if you're going to get more than $500,000, I think it's a year, but maybe total, you have to file a data sharing plan. Now, there are no instructions to the reviewers of the grant proposals as to how to evaluate or prioritize the data sharing plan. Mm. So your data sharing plan could be, I'm not going to share the data, right? Because that's still a plan, right? And there's no sort of standard way to evaluate those plans. And there's no instructions as to whether or not a good data sharing plan should increase the funding profile of one application versus another one. The data sharing plans are not published, so you don't know for any given grant what the data sharing plan that was filed was. There is no tracking mechanism to track whether or not people are complying with the data sharing plan that they filed. And none of this is used to factor into the next grant application for the individual that filed. So it's there, but it's not as effective as it could be if it simply became more transparent and more trackable. And that's something that we are proposing at Creative Commons, is that anytime that a data sharing plan is filed, it should be publicly available and associated with the grant number, so that we at least know what people promised they would do.
Right.
That's sort of the start. Now, I would be very remiss if I didn't point out that the NIH has been one of the greatest forces in the world for the collection and promulgation of shared open data. Mainly, starting with the human genome, but moving on, the U.S. National Center for Biotech Information is, just amazing how much stuff they've got. But it's for the most part what I would call foundational information, things that don't change in experiments, things like the genome, things like the genome of hundreds of different organisms, protein sequences, and so forth. But they're beginning now, and certainly they're beginning to collect gene expression data in a public way. They've really worked hard to be at the forefront of it. But if they made these couple little tweaks, it could be a lot more powerful. Now, to the second question of national security, this isn't usually that big of a deal in the traditional National Institutes of Health funding. It is quite a big deal in the emerging field of synthetic biology or biological engineering, because that's a field in which you're taking what we know about genes and genomes, and instead of using them to intervene in human bodies, you use that knowledge to actually program bacteria to do your will. And the danger there is obviously that someone takes the concept of a computer virus and externalizes that to us.
Yeah, that someone like me could get a hold of it and have my ultimate bacteria that would do whatever it is that I want to do to take over the world. Mm.
Right. I mean, even more prosaically, the sequence of the 1917 flu genome is online. Right? So what would it take for me to insert that or improve it? That's certainly the fear there. I used to have an office at MIT near one of the major labs for synthetic biology, and you would occasionally see men in very dark suits walking around there from the government who were worried about that. But they're figuring those norms out as a field, and the debate is fairly open, which is good. And then there's also there's the more broad question of public data in the sense of should we have data about utility usage in the United States? It's a very prosaic kind of data, and it's good to know because then you can say when are we going to have a blackout in San Francisco when the weather's hot? But the same data publication, I could run. The energy system is a network. I could run Cisco network analysis on that data, and it would tell me which routers are most likely to fail, and that gives me a list of terrorist targets. Right. Mm-hmm. There's a million nightmare scenarios that I can invent, which are sort of it's fun when you're having a beer, where we can misuse the data. But to my mind, the net present risk of those compared to the risk of people dying today of cancer, the risk of electric grids going down today because they're not balanced right, the risk of any of the more prosaic day-to-day problems, I think those risks are much greater, although they're not as sort of Hollywood sexy as the ones that we can war game. I think those argue in favor of open data as a default rule. Now, the key is that right now we have a system where the default rule is to not make things open, and it's very difficult to opt out and make it open. So if you make the default rule that something should be open, then we also need to rebalance that and make it easy to opt out if there actually is a pressing concern, whether that's a privacy concern, or security concern, or health concern. You've got to make it easy to opt out of the system because the things that really need to be private really need to be private. So also, it's San Francisco. It's 4:30 in the afternoon. I think everyone's is playing Farmville or something on the block. Right.
It's break time. We're gonna play Farmville.
Yeah, the internet always slows down here in the afternoon, and that's not because of the CC folks. I think it's the block we're on.
That's really funny. That's interesting. I'd love to find out. Talking about open data. What are people doing on your block at particular times of day? What are the data uses at particular times of day? And it could help with management. It would be great to have it open. That, this is the time of day to do my email and nothing more than that. Or, it could help, but it also could be, get into people's personal privacy issues.
Well, this gets right, and that problem actually, although we got into it from sort of a humorous angle, that's actually a real problem, right? Which is, where's the line in terms of societal benefit and personal privacy. There's a real value to having most everyone's genome out there mapped to their health issues, because then we can begin to associate genomic variations with clinical outcomes. But if it gets to the point where we get denied life insurance because we share a set of traits that bias us towards autism, that's arguably not good for society.
Right.
It's good for insurance companies, but it's not great for us.
Yeah, and so you need to balance it somehow. Figure out what's the best way to balance it. And I think that's it. That's the biggest part of the question, the issue right now is how do we balance it? And like you were saying earlier, right now it's a limited elite who are making these decisions and who are even involved in this conversation to begin with. It's not the majority of people.
Right, and science used to be something that average people did. If you read some of the stories of, it was sort of science was something that people did in England 200 years ago without having to be PhD scientists.
Yeah, I'm going to go outside into nature, and I'm going to write things down in my lab notebook.
Exactly. And, it's really been in the post-war era in the U.S. that we have, sort of after the Manhattan Project, that we really built this concept of science as something we proxy to the elites. And, my hope is that at least we're always going to need the elites. I think we're always going to need the elite-trained people to do some of this work. But I think there's a growing understanding that, people everywhere have a certain amount of smart people in their midst, and they might not all be PhDs, they might not all be wealthy, but there's a power that we can come to collectively on some problems that's enormously valuable. And for those that are in the elite, having to have their work checked by the rest of the world isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, no, not necessarily. What have been, we've talked a bit about, some of the challenges to the open data structure. Are there any more that we maybe haven't gotten into? The things that are that are really challenging to get past?
Well, I think the big one in the room is funding, which is that, data is expensive to make. But there's a saying in the community that open data is, they say in free software, is it free as in beer, in the sense that I give you a free beer and I don't charge you for it, or is it free as in speech, in which I give you the rights to do something? And my favorite line in open data is that it's free as in a puppy.
As in a puppy?
Yeah. So if
Please explain.
I give you a puppy, if I give you a puppy, even if it's a really expensive puppy, what I've given you is a multi-year cost burden. Right? Because you've got to raise the dog, feed the dog, take the dog to the vet. And you might get an enormous emotional benefit out of having a dog. I certainly do with my dog.
But the dog isn't giving you money. Unless it's like a show dog or a trick dog somehow.
And I have a feeling those are pretty expensive to do too, Yeah. So you've got to make an investment in open data. You've got to decide what you're going to keep and what you're going to try to regenerate later. You've got to decide how you're going to annotate that data, how you're going to curate it so that somebody else can use it. You've got to provide a storage facility and backup for that data. You've got to provide bandwidth for that data. And you've got to pay people to do all those things.
Right.
And so I think the governments are probably going to have to make that a priority, at least until it's considered worthwhile and cheap enough for the private sector to sell it as a service. Because right now we're sort of in this gray zone where some data is willing to be stored by the government, some data isn't. You've got cloud services emerging, but it's unclear if they'll be here in 15, 20, 30, 50, 100 years. And that's the big question is sort of the funding and the infrastructure for data, because we just don't know what it's going to look like.
Yeah, so in terms of those things that are going to be there or not going to be there, the cloud storage services, I know Microsoft is working on a cloud storage service for academics specifically. Is that the kind of thing that you're referring to?
Yeah, and it's easy to, so it's easy to sort of get lured in and say, let's just use these private cloud services. And I certainly don't have a problem with them. We've got some stuff that we do in the cloud, obviously. But remember the hype with which Google Wave launched?
Yeah.
Right?
Bye-bye.
It got shut down this week. Right?
Yeah.
These are not infrastructure services yet.
Yeah.
Because they exist at sort of the will and the whim of the companies that provide them. And so I think that's the hard part, and that's where the governments and the funders of science are going to have to step up and say, what they really want to have happen and commit to a funding level. It's tempting to sort of talk about a web for data, like we have a web for documents. And I think for things like our cable usage data example, that we can do that. You can get a lot of benefit out of the existing web for that. But when we're talking about complicated adaptive systems like the human body or climate change, I think we need to be thinking more at the level of the highway system or the Tennessee Valley Authority. This is a long-term public infrastructure project that's going to take the sort of non-recoverable expenses that only governments put up in the short term.
Huh. That's a really interesting, insightful way to think about it. What have been some successes? What are some of the great things that you can say Science Commons is working in these areas?
Well, I think the first one is that we've been, our existence is at least correlated with an explosion in open access journals, and there's now thousands of open access journals in the world, and we've increased the number of those using the Creative Commons licenses from in the low sort of dozens to about 1,500 journals now. And so that's certainly a big win. We've seen the licenses go into use from the White House to Wikipedia in the last couple of years. And some of those tools that we've created that go beyond copyright, things like our materials transfer agreements, which only a lawyer or a tech transfer office can love, are starting to now cover things like the stem cell lines for the Personal Genome Project. So if you are a credentialed researcher at any academic lab, you can go to the Coriell Cell Culture Repository website and with essentially one-click order these stem cell lines that are associated with the full sequence genome and the health interview for $85. And you can use them for commercial purposes. You can use them for clinical purposes. You don't have to ask permission. And there's 10 now, but there's going to be 100,000 of those. And I think that's a really big success because you'll be able to essentially virtualize elements of clinical trials in 10 years. You'll be able to say, find me the stem cells of all of the Caucasian males in their late 40s who used to smoke. With one click, $85 a line, you'll be able to test the compounds in cell lines and see if they work or not. And that's the sort of thing that we get excited about. I think some of the other successes have certainly been around convincing people to use good licenses for open data. So we've got the Polar Information Commons, which is the output of the International Polar Year under our tools. GSK recently put out a major malaria data set where they used our legal tools, not just to publish the data, but to public domain all of the chemical structures that were bioactive against the malaria genome. Sage Bionetworks, which I sit on the board of, which is taken about $200 million worth of Merck's internal disease biology program and begun to systematically release it. These are a few of the examples that I think start to hint at what can be done here.
I think it sounds pretty amazing. And there's also a project that I was taking a look at that was a brain project, so making the human brain available online to anybody.
So it's a little different. It's called the Neuro Commons, and this was I'm sort of when it comes to technology, I'm a semantic web geek, and the idea was we did an analysis of all of these different databases that were paid for using public funds. And if you look at like the Oxford Annual Journal Review, they categorize something like 1,100 distinct public databases in the life sciences. And so you've got to, and Google doesn't work very well on them because Google was designed for documents, not for databases. So you can't run queries that sort of cut or skip from one database to another database, which is how scientists actually think. So the goal of the Neuro Commons project was to actually begin to wire the databases together into a network so that you could ask interesting questions. And the question that we started with was, given what's in the public databases, what might be plausible drug targets for Alzheimer's? And the way that you would ask that question from a data perspective would be, what are some signal transduction genes in pyramidal neurons? And so we systematically started wiring together these databases and data sources, and then into one big integrated data source using standard web tools. And then we provide a query engine so that you can write these sorts of questions. And we give the whole thing away, of course, and the back end, the database now gets about, I guess, 35,000 questions a day get asked of the engine by machines and robots and people across the world.
That's a lot of questions.
Yeah, it sort of shocked me. Most of it comes from 3 universities that appear to run automated systematic queries against the system, which is exactly what we designed it for, but it's always nice when that happens.
Right, so they're using it the way that you designed it, which that's pretty good.
Doesn't usually happen.
It's really good. So instead of having so this is a document service, basically, that a database that people can query and find information.
Yeah, and it's also supposed to be a proof of concept. The idea is that we don't build our computers from scratch. Most of us, we buy a packaged operating system, and then we can install software because the operating system is relatively standard. And the idea is we should have something like that for databases, so that if you've got another life sciences database, rather than recapping the 2.5 years, 3 years of work we did to do this, you can simply install it into our integrated system at no cost to yourself and with all the rights you need to do whatever you want, and then instantly get the benefit of having your database be integrated with all of these other systems. It ought to be, rather than having databases be like snowflakes, they should all be relatively standardized so that everyone that writes a new database can integrate it with all of the other databases, because there's this sort of seed crystal of commonly developed, freely available integrated databases. So the methodology we built is something that we're promoting, not just in the life sciences, but in climate sciences, earth sciences, and elsewhere. It's just a good way to deal with databases that weren't designed to play nice together.
Right. And if you can promote that, then the databases, all the databases might play nicely together, as opposed to having all sorts of different platforms and different ways of designing the databases, different ways of getting into of how they're packaged, how people get into them, which ends up being a mess because then they can't talk to each other.
That's exactly right. And you're a life scientist originally, right?
Right.
So here's a trivial example, which is that there's one database that maps medical subject headings to PubMed articles. And so for the audience, if you're not sort of used to this, medical subject headings are like card catalog headings for the journal articles. There's another one that indexes gene IDs so genes that are in the paper to those same papers. And there's another one that says what those genes do. But you can't use those 3 data sources at the same time to ask for any given set of papers, what are the genes in them and what do they do, even though all that information is already out there. And that's the sort of problem we wanted to deal with.
Right. I have a question about who is actually funding the development of things like the Neuro Commons and the promotion of these ideas. Is this government funding or is this private funding? Where is this coming from mostly?
Well, it's been a mix so far. We got our start with private foundation funding. We actually were very fortunate to build a relationship from the beginning with the Cure Huntington's Disease Initiative, CHDI, which is a private effort to cure Huntington's disease that is one of those groups that's really willing to try to buck the existing system and to make things happen faster and different. And they gave us our foundational investment. We've received some money from the MacArthur Foundation, from the Omidyar Network, the Kauffman Foundation for Entrepreneurship, from Sergey Brin and Ann Wojcicki, and from a variety of other funders that have sort of helped us stitch it together. We are just beginning now to branch out and to get some government funding, either as a subcontractor or as a PI. And we've been able to build some relationships on a consulting basis with other organizations as well. So you sort of have to mix and match, especially in a recession, to keep these sorts of nonprofit efforts going and alive. But we've been fortunate that there's been enough private funders and foundations that see the value we give to really not only be able to survive but to thrive even in a down economy.
With all of this going on, what is your personal angle on this? Is this something that you are personally passionate about? Why the Science Commons? Why the Creative Commons for you as a career choice?
So yes, I'm passionate about it. I don't think I could do what I do if I weren't passionate about it. In terms of why, I don't know if I can give you a simple reason. I studied philosophy and languages in university, and the philosophical appeal of what we're doing here from a knowledge perspective, I specifically studied epistemology and theory of knowledge. And knowledge is this open social construct that we create together. And the potential that the internet brings us to put knowledge together and to make knowledge more valuable is something that sort of blows me away every time I really think about it seriously. And I think one of the great tragedies that we could have as a culture would be to have the opportunity to really increase the total amount, distribution, and value of knowledge and not take advantage of it. Either because our default systems weren't set up to handle it, or because we didn't have the vision or the will or the people to do it. And I take a certain amount of, if not us, who, and if not now, when, of an approach to this. Because there's a lot of people out there who are trained as scientists who don't have the leeway to make these sort of changes happen. They've got to keep their own labs going. And, I can do this. This is not something where I have spent my whole life training myself into a zone where I have to go get lab grants. This is something that I can spend 10 years of my life working on. And I think it's something that if I look back in 30 or 40 years, if I didn't do this, I would look back and kick myself because I had the chance to.
Right. You had the chance to be involved in something like this.
Yeah. And I think that one of the mantras we have inside the organization is that what we're doing is akin to building another layer of the internet. And if you could have been part of the original internet or the original web, wouldn't you want to?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the sort of thing that, when I'm horribly jet lagged and exhausted and tired and I have to go ask somebody for money, that's the sort of thing I say to myself in the mirror, at least.
There is a bigger purpose behind this.
Exactly.
Exactly. And you can tell yourself that that you don't have to fly as much anymore either, because now you're in San Francisco with the Creative Commons offices as opposed to being in Boston.
Although clearly I need to get better internet and video RAM if I'm going to pull that off.
Right, obviously. For all of the meetings that you're going to have to not fly to, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any other organizations that are doing similar stuff to what Science Commons is attempting?
Yeah, it depends on which piece you're looking at. There are other orgs working on open data. Certainly SPARC, which is the Scholarly Publishing and Research Resources Coalition in Washington, is an important player in open data. The Open Knowledge Foundation in the UK is someone that I've worked with off and on for the years. In materials transfer, you've got, in technology transfer, you've got important players like the Kauffman Foundation and the Association of University Technology Managers and so forth. In the open patent space, you've got the peer-to-patent folks at New York University. You've got Richard Jefferson and the folks at Cambia in Australia. You know, what I don't know that we really have a lot of peers or partners in is organizations that look at all of these issues as part of a single system. So we have a lot of people we work with in each of those separate spaces. The nice thing about being nonprofit is that we don't have to compete. If one of us wins and the Commons wins, we all win. So we do a lot of collaborating there, but it's one of the nice things about being at Creative Commons is we have the leeway to look across all of these zones, not just being sort of pigeonholed into data or materials or patents or journals or what have you.
And on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for joining me today. This has been a really interesting conversation. It's been a lot of fun to talk with you about the Science Commons, and so thank you for joining me and for telling everybody about what it is that you do and what the Science Commons is involved in and how important it is to, to levels of society even beyond the scientists.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kiki. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And if anybody out there is interested in checking out what John does and checking out the Science Commons, you can find the Science Commons at www.creativecommons.org/science, and that will end up forwarding you to sciencecommons.org, where you can find information about the projects they're working on, resources and partners, find out a lot of more stuff that's going on. And John also has his own blog. What did I do with it? Common Knowledge, here it is, which is still at Science Blogs, even after the Science Blogs Pepsi hubbub took place. You have your own reasons for sticking with Science Blogs, and I believe you have a post in your blog all about it. Is that right?
Indeed, I do.
Great. So if anyone's interested in reading what you have to say, your discourse on the public domain on open science, that is at scienceblogs.com/common knowledge. Again, my guest has been John Wilbanks from the Science Commons. And thanks once again.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It's been great talking to you. And for everyone else out there, if you are interested, the show will be on the air again next Thursday. However, I don't know who's going to be on the show with me. It's a grab bag. We'll find something fun and interesting and sciencey. Unfortunately, I can't give you advance notice right now, so I'll just tease that it's gonna be fun. It'll be the Science Hour. If you are interested in downloading any past episodes of the Science Hour, you can go to twit.tv/Kiki. You can download it in audio or video form as a podcast. And I do suggest that you give that a try, because that's what counts. The downloads, that's what people count. I don't know, the streaming numbers, I don't know if anyone's counting those anymore. So download those. You can find me online at Dr. Kiki on Twitter. I am Dr. Kiki at drkiki.tv through the email, or drkiki@twit.tv, whichever one you prefer. You can find my website, drkiki.tv, and I don't know, I'm on Facebook too. There are other places. Thanks so much for joining me. I do appreciate the time out of your day for you to join, listen to the science, maybe learn something, and I do hope that it made your world a whole lot more interesting. See you next week. And I'd also love to say that I'd like to open up the Dr. Kiki theme song. I was inspired by Buzz Out Loud and the remixing and hacking of the Buzz Out Loud theme song. So if there's anyone out there who has musical talents and is interested in, using their spare time toward a fun project like remixing the Dr. Kiki theme song, I want to hear something different. I want to hear something fun. Jazz it up, do whatever, give it, whatever spicy touches you want to, whatever floats your musical boat. Send it to me. I'd love to hear it. So again, This is the Dr. Kiki remix. Is it a competition? Sure, it's a competition. You might win if I like it. That's the key. Who's the judge? Me.